Just to get started then, as Maddie said, my name is Mosa Mpetha. I'm a film programmer and curator based in Leeds, and I...
Do you want to say? I'm not sure.
Yeah. And I co-founded something called Black Cinema Project back a couple of years ago, and I also am a programmer in the engagement department in Hyde Park Picture House in Leeds.
I'm Darragh, Amelia. I work around preservation, production, and presentation of audiovisual art alongside Jesse and Mhando, who you will see shortly. We work with a collective, or as a collective also, called Ajabu Ajabu. And we've been restoring access, or working on restoring access to a film called Maangamizi from Tanzania that you will hear a lot about in this session, and that June is very familiar with as well. And it's also included in this strand of the festival, so I hope you'll all have a chance to see it. Yeah, and so we're also missing Liz
Chege, the director of African Motion Festival, who's supposed to be here, but due to the trains, she could not be. But she has written down her answers, so if I can, I'll try and feed them in.
Yes.
But I think also we might try and look to recording this session, transcribing, and then adding in additional notes, so we'll be able to share that as well.
Yeah, and in this case, also Mosa is going to be answering the questions on behalf of a UK exhibitor or programmer, and I'm going to pose the questions instead.
Yeah, me, all of those things.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very honored to be having this conversation today with both of you. Oh, and with Jesse. Is Jesse here yet? Or are they on? They're online. They're available. Their faces are going to show up on the screen eventually.
I think, yeah, let's let June introduce herself, and then we'll introduce the others.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm June Givanni. I run the June Givanni Pan-African Cinema Archive. It's an archive that's based on over 30 years of curating Pan-African cinema. So it's a very physical archive, yet to be digitized. But of course it comes up to present day, so some of the material is digital, but mainly it's analog materials. It's Pan-African cinema, so it's cinema of the African continent, but also Black British cinema, Caribbean cinema, African American cinema, cinema for the whole Pan-African diaspora. It's based in London at Mayday Rooms. That's where our little space is, and partly at home. And I had it in storage for very many years, and then was able to take it out of storage when I got a space to begin to sift through it. Is that Emma? Oh, I didn't know you were coming. Oh, and Jay? Oh, okay. Emma is one of my co-directors and a great supporter of the work of the archive and its development for many years. We met years ago when I used to run the African Caribbean unit at the British Film Institute, and founded the Black Film Bulletin and all of those sort of things. But now the archive is run by three directors, myself, Emma, and Imra Bakari, filmmaker. And we have a lot of materials, and we do all sorts of events to present the material, and the material is in many different formats, not just films, but all of the contextual materials for that.
And Martin and Jesse, can you hear us here? Okay, perfect. Can we hear them too as well? Is it possible?
Can you hear us?
Ah, yes, perfect. Loud and clear.
Hi from Zanzibar.
And so, yeah, Martin is the director of Maangamizi, and also the director of Zanzibar International Film Festival. And Jesse is a co-founder of Ajabu Ajabu, amongst many other things. hello to you both.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Martin. And a big hello from Imre. Oh, a big hello from Imre.
Is that microphone working? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Hello, June.
Yeah, so as reflected in the strand that we put together for this year's festival, we're interested in the restitution of archival film, in how these stories that are documented on film can effectively be returned to the people and to the places that have forged them. Through our collaborative work, we reimagine preservation along the lines of ensuring continuous access to film by global film communities, and prioritizing the cultural value of film, at least on par with its economic value. And so we wanted to hold this discussion to hear from practitioners who are similarly interrogating questions around ownership and improving access to the archive, and who are challenging traditional systems within the hierarchical system of distribution, film distribution. And yeah, Mosa, did you want to build on that?
Essentially, we're just really excited to have this conversation with the people here, but also with you as well. I feel like it's really good to be sharing this conversation in what we can all be doing with regards to the preservation of access. And then my whole ambition really with this discussion was so we could share what we're doing, the problems that we're facing, and how the sector can support as well. So please do feed into the conversation. We can do questions afterwards, and then we're also here this evening as well to have more chats with you.
Yeah. And so the first question that we have is around ownership and theft of film ownership from its filmmakers and from its countries of origin. It's our understanding that the rights holders of African cinema are predominantly in the global north, far away from its authors and the audiences that the work most often represents. So we'd like to know from the panel how or why this imbalance exists, your understanding of why this imbalance exists and why it continues to exist, and how you are attempting to remedy it through your work. So perhaps a nice way to start also to get them speaking on the screen here is with Jesse and Martin, and because Maangamizi has an important story to tell around ownership. So maybe you guys can expand a little bit on that.
Okay, thank you, Darragh. Thank you, Watershed. We're very excited to be here at Cinema Rediscovered. To answer your question, so with Maangamizi, which is directed by Martin, we we did a restoration 20 years after its initial release, a re-release 20 years after it was released in 2001, and we deliberately targeted informal spaces and like local and communal cinema houses. And I think really where it began with the story with Maangamizi, it wasn't really an attempt to sort of take back this film. It wasn't really about that. Yeah. When we screened Maangamizi in our space, Ajabu Ajabu, we were completely shocked that it was the Tanzanian premiere. And so we just wanted to show this film because it had been a while, and we thought it would be a good moment to revisit the story and to hear the filmmakers talk about this being the first time that this 20-year-old film is seen by a Tanzanian audience was surprising at first, but then it was in line with all of the other films from the continent that we've been trying to show at Ajabu Ajabu. And so with that knowledge in mind, what we are trying to do, how we are trying to address that imbalance, and I would state that imbalance is one of just like differing ideas about the conditions in which film can exist. I think the frameworks of cinema still defer to an idea of a film as that's like as an object, as something that can be closed or opened, whereas like if you view it in the form of storytelling, stories really don't have those kinds of limitations. So there's kind of, I would describe it as a lack of nuance in dealing with distributors, because their conditions around what us as a small cinema in the continent can show are based on a very closed interpretation of what an audience is supposed to do. And I think that that's what I would describe as a closed interpretation. I think that that is really, yeah, it's based on the assumptions of what a healthy film ecosystem looks like. And that is just, a lot of that is based on what on a conception of audience that's based on like what people that really prioritizes the economics over the culture. So I think how we are sort of addressing how we're taking it back is really just trying to start conversations like this to try and add a few more layers about how we can conceive of audience, of the role of audience, and how we can have more nuance in the conditions in which we share these stories. That over time, as we learn more about different film cultures, hopefully lead to a more inclusive film ecosystem. And so we were very glad with Maangamizi that Martin was open, that first of all, that he and Ron Mulvihill retained the rights to the film. And so they were able to listen to us when we said we wanted to take it to spaces in which most of the sort of generative and where we find most of the more generative and experimental modes of film distribution are happening here in Tanzania.
Thank you, Jesse. Just to add on to what Jesse said, I think the question of ownership, in a sense with Maangamizi, of course, the ownership of the content itself is ours, but we don't really own the distribution side at all. That's where our problems began. I mean, from day one, we didn't own in any way how the film would be distributed, whether worldwide or in the country. And when when Maangamizi was made, it was during the time when not only, I think in Tanzania, it was all the cinemas. And at some point, Tanzania had something like 53 cinemas in the country. And yet by the time that we were making Maangamizi, there was none available for distribution. It was a very difficult time. And so we kind of never went into the distribution side at all, except for screening the film in Zanzibar for about 7 days. And then I think we also showed it in Dar es Salaam and Moshi for a couple of days, and that was all. Because of the fact that we didn't own the time privately to actually put the films on the screen. Distribution-wise, the Tanzania Film Company, which was the government wing of the distribution side of film, had, I think, something about 30% of all the screening time in the country. But there were no films that were owned by the Tanzania Film Company at all. And therefore, they actually were selling time off to all the other distributors who were able to bring films and screen them in the cinemas. And therefore, when we came in to show our film, we also had to kind of buy time from these distributors. And it was very difficult, for us. And not only that, the fact that we knew that it would be very difficult for us to promote the film because we didn't have the wherewithal to actually promote the film. And also there was little interest in distributing Tanzanian or especially African-made films. The market was technically for low-grade B, films from the West or top-range films from India. And so we were, in many ways, constrained by that kind of thinking and by that kind of ownership. And therefore, we certainly agree with lots of comrades that one of the key issues that we need to deal with is actually ownership. And not only ownership of the content, but ownership of the means by which that content can be distributed to reach audiences. Therefore, that's a major question that I think we're still struggling with in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Martin. Thanks, Jay. June, can you comment on this from the perspective of your archive and your experiences around ownership and access?
First of all, what the guys are just saying is actually something that people find very curious, and a lot of filmmakers have been struggling with this for a long time. The fact that they don't own, not only on one side, they don't own the rights to their films, and I think that has been particularly bad for a lot of Francophone African filmmakers, because where they maybe had some financial support from the French, that support always came tied to a French producer. And so very often the films were licensed to the French producer. And so when you get decades down the line and the filmmaker wants to do something with their film, they want to do something else with their film, or they want even to show it, that has to go through this person in Europe who has the rights for it. But also the other aspect of this sort of very unfair situation is that if they want to show it anywhere, or they want it to be shown anywhere, they have to pay for it to be shown, even in their own countries. Mm-hmm. They have to pay to put it on screen, whether in cinemas or on television even, because very often we think that TV can support that sort of material, but the history has been that no, they haven't. They have been charging filmmakers to put their films on screen. So ownership is been a very tortured relationship within this whole process. And I think that a lot of what has happened is that there has been continual discussion and debate around how to get beyond that. It hasn't managed to move very far. And in fact, as we were saying just earlier, the whole situation now has moved even further away, or even made even more difficult, since this focus by a lot of film institutions and film market institutions around black film, around African cinema, around moving into an area that they believe, since Black Lives Matter, and so that they have been, they haven't done very well in, and have jumped a bit onto this sort of area of bandwagon, I suppose you could say, because they are now trying to claim ownership of a lot of things. Even film institutions within the West who may have not done very much with the material that they do own at the level that they the French producers would be owning the rights, and the companies, the organizations within Europe that put money into the films in some way. And that is also the case for some Black British work as well, where they have money, they received a grant from either Arts Council or Channel 4 or wherever. Some of those rights are also being clawed back through the organizations that own or that hold those archives. Things are happening that are making things very difficult for people. And one of the people we've been speaking with around this is Jihan El Tahiri, who is a filmmaker, an Egyptian filmmaker. She runs something in Berlin called Docsbox, which set up a manifesto about reclaiming and the restitution of films from for the African continent from various institutions in Europe, and not just from institutions, but from the whole market. And that is quite complex because very often they aren't able to. The fact is that those institutions are are preferring to take the position that the filmmaker is no longer the owner of the project. And the reason I mention Jihan is because she's somebody who's very well known, has made very immersive documentaries where she's given years of her life, whether it's in the ICAIC archives in Cuba to make her film Cuba, An African Odyssey, or at the ANC in South Africa to make her very immersive documentary Behind the Rainbow. I think it's Behind the Rainbow, and others. And, she's told the story of having had to go back to the French producer for some of her to get access to some of her work, either to show it, but also to use some of the footage in a film that she was going to be making afterwards. So it is to do with ownership that prevents them actually using it in which ways they would like to use it. So it goes beyond just screening, and in that case that she was trying to find the material, or that she was trying to get access to the material, she was actually going to be charged for using material that she herself shot that she used in the film. The complexity of ownership is one that really does need quite a lot of unpacking. And I mention that because it's an organization that has a manifesto that actually is looking at this in a more in-depth way. For us, we run an archive where, as I say, people would give us films or give me films in the years of curating. So we have a lot of films in the archive that we don't own. The films remain the legitimate owners of the filmmaker or of the person, if it's another institution, that owns the rights to it. But what we are able to do is to make those available for people to come and view. And what we do own, which I also think is quite an important aspect of this question of restitution, and I'll quote something that Jihan said recently that I think makes a lot of sense, is that it's not just the image and it's not just the films, it's the whole context in which the films were made, in which they were shown, and that sort of thing. And that's what our archive does, and we support the filmmakers who are trying very much to have this, because not everyone has kept. A lot of them haven't even kept their films, because we're in situations where we're providing the filmmaker with a copy of the films, but also we keep a lot of the materials around it. There's a lot more I could say, but we'll move it.
Yeah, just to follow on, I guess, from what you were saying about the shift from the last couple of years and the kind of the refocus on organisations and institutions trying to programme certain work, and how it's brilliant on one hand because there's an interest, but then on the other hand, these new barriers that are coming into place. I know that I can speak on behalf of Liz when she wrote in her response to this, that there's certain films now that are just a blanket have not become available because video on demand sources have picked them up, because they need to look like, they need to do their version of distribution. It's becoming harder and harder for grassroots and people who've been doing the work for a very long time to be able to now access these works because of this new interest, which I just think is really interesting. It just feels like a new layer of difficulty. And I guess the other thing I'd just say is, just relating back to what you said about Francophone work, which I know particularly complicated to try and acquire rights. And another thing that Liz had told me to share was, there's an instance, for example, she wanted to screen a Moroccan film in Glasgow, but then wasn't able to until it was screened in France. So France is always getting priority, So I think these examples of things are happening in that there are people who are working around it, and I know that they're looking at shifting a law now, but like you said, it is definitely still a process. And anyone who does programme this work, we can see how frustrating it can be. Yes. But I think moving on to access, which I know is the next question, I think it's about how do we get the audiences, in to see these films.
And I would actually like to ask you that as well, with the example case study of Black Cinema Project and how you've facilitated that access and built ownership within audiences.
Yeah. So there's two things I could talk about. One is with regards to Black Cinema Project, which was a space in which we brought people together. It was online, it was during the COVID period, and we curated a programme weekly of film that was all available online for free. So we're looking at YouTube, we're looking at Vimeo, we were kind of trawling through different listing sites of where you could find Black and African archives. And then we curated a programme out of that and brought together a group of exclusively Black people to watch these films and then talk about how we felt. Because we were finding that myself and Samra, who set it up, that when we were in majority white cinema spaces watching these films, it's very hard to kind of share your opinions on the films because it felt very representative. So this was a gathering of not all film people, actually most people were not film people, and we would watch these films. We started with a pure African archive entry point for the first season, and the result, it was just fantastic because there was once people started to realise these films existed, it just meant so much. So it kind of opened our minds, I guess, the fact that these films do exist. They're just really hard to find out about. And one of the big things as well we were looking at is recontextualising the films and reinterpreting them. So making sure that the conversations we were having around the films were relevant to us today. So we realised that was the thing that was really important, is how do we connect to the films? What does it mean to us today? How does it relate to the TV show that we've been watching recently? All of that was really important in a way for us to dissect these types of films and make them relevant to now. And then one of the other things that I do in Hyde Park Picture House, I know that we've heard from Wendy before, and the fact that the cinema itself isn't open yet because of a redevelopment, but I'm developing a new permanent film strand as part of the cinema for when it reopens, which is called Cinema Africa. So it's permanent part of the cinema programme to be screening African work. And one of the things, the approach that I've taken with that is I'm working very closely with Leeds African Communities Trust. So it's a community group that represents several different African communities, and the whole thing has been collaborative. So essentially it's a long-term permanent project in which we started with surveying, talking to people, what kind of films do people want to see, how, etc. And then building an advisory group and just starting to really demystify what does it mean to put on a film and talk more about the heritage of films and the background of it, and then inform them of my curational choices. So then we've been doing some test screenings. We don't have a building, so we're going to different spaces and trialling that out. It's been quite, you know, the plus side of not having the cinema means we can go to people as well, which has been fantastic. And the response has been great. People are really excited. It is at the start, and I'm under no illusions that we've solved it, that's it. It's very much, for me, about the long-term effort. And I think what I found is, especially since 2020, there is a sense of kind of urgency to program things. Now, get one program, the audience will come. You know, we've done our diversity screening, and I think there needs to be more long-term, sustained commitments and collaborations. That's the kind of big thing I've been finding. Building the trust with the community I'm working with. We're still at the start. Once we're in the building, they almost, there's been a lot of, you know, but are we actually going to be seeing these films in the cinema on the big screen? I'm like, yes, it's going to happen. But we just need the proofs in the pudding. So we just need to show it. But I think that's very much my passion, is to, and a slight frustration is that things aren't one-off events. These are different types of films. African heritage film is special. It requires time and energy, and the recontextualizing and reinterpretation is so important. Instead of just throwing a film of a style that people may never have seen before and expect people to immediately understand or know how to engage with it. So yeah, that's very much the focus point of what I've been doing with Access.
Jay, I also want to ask you, maybe you can speak a bit about your experience around accessing cinema and accessing African cinema specifically, and how that has led to how we operate with Ajabu Ajabu in terms of access, and how the Maangamizi rollout has worked.
We started Ajabu Ajabu in it was early 2020, and it's a small cinema space where we do screenings and conversations, and sometimes multidisciplinary film events that mix and reinterpret film according to, in concert with other art forms. It's really, in terms of the city, it's and in terms of film space in the city, it's really the only place in which film is not. It's like there are already such few cinemas in Dar es Salaam, in like 4, in the traditional sense, but cinema spaces that sort of operate outside of that exhibit films that aren't from Hollywood, that sort of try and engage the audience in any different ways, or that really try to preserve, that try to include or integrate conversation and exchange as part of the cinematic experience. I think we're probably the only one that does it in sort of a formalized way. I think one of the things that we found very, very quickly in opening up a space like that, in having conversations with filmmakers, in doing projects such as the Maangamizi project, in which the film was re-released together with creative interpretations of the poster and other sort of artistic engagements, such as live rescoring by a group in Nairobi, and things that can sort of provide a platform for ways of reimagining how the story creates through creativity as a whole within the context of Tanzania, within the context of East Africa, and also that just really, I think, connects. It really opens up the the possibility of widens the possibility of connection through engaging all these different arts, through providing people with a way into the story that feels right for them. So with Maangamizi, our first event around it was just like a traditional retrospective at the Zanzibar Film Festival, but there we had a poster exhibition, and we have been actively finding routes towards expanding how people can engage with the film, with the recognition of exactly what Mosa is saying, that people haven't been generally, you'll find audiences don't stand and wait. Like there's people haven't been, even if a film is momentous, even if a film carries really important stories, I think like as an exhibitor, you find that you need to have that sort of the humility to understand that that the that interest and engagement presents itself in different ways. And so the places in which we found that sort of openness, as I said, we are the only sort of formalized alternative cinema and moving image space, but there are plenty of cinemas, plenty of places in which these kinds of conversations are happening in their own way in the city. It's just a lot of the work of these spaces, of these informal spaces that cater to marginalized communities, that cater to largely working class neighborhoods. A lot of those places their work is completely delegitimized because they're not really on the map. I mean, any kind of framework doesn't really make space for somebody who wants to wants to watch a film but can't afford to, right? Like that's you've already a lot of any kind of frames, like getting people to a place where they can pay, and there's nothing wrong in and of itself that makes sense, because of course a lot of there's a lot of investment coming from different places for any given film, and each film's financial story is different. But I think where it sort of really becomes creates difficulty is when that's the when there are assumptions within the economics that basically create an entry point that's way too high. It's unachievable. There are these neighborhoods that would be able to watch film in a legitimate way, would have to have an amount of money pouring into those spaces that, for social political reasons, is not really feasible. So for that reason, there are countless neighborhoods in Dar es Salaam in which the rights in terms of just the policies, their right of access to film it doesn't exist, and so this is how they create their own spaces for film, spaces that are deliberately removed, but almost by being removed are able to sort of solve problems in a way that speaks to the realities of the situation, rather than deferring to any preconceived notion for what film can be. So with Ajabu Ajabu, that the presence of these spaces where not only just regular houses are converted into really effective communal bases based around moving image, based around film, but where new solutions like dubbing and reinterpreting film into Kiswahili just generated as part and parcel of the experience of film within those certain settings. There was a barrier there in terms of language, and it was solved, and there's now countless fairly well-known dubbing artists who make their living just reinterpreting these films and live dubbing over the track so that
Video
more people
jockeys.
can be included.
The video jockeys.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so, and so all of that is to say is that when we started to take on Maangamizi, it was with the recognition that that Ajabu Ajabu as a space was, I guess through the fact that we had greater access, we were able to formalize a lot of ideas that exist as standard in a lot of places, but as exist in ways that are that are delegitimized in a local level and criminalized at an international level. And so, like finding a balance between that, finding ways of, at the very least, with this film, acknowledging that that the capacity to build a citywide conversation around cinematic experience exists, and the reason why it's not, the reason why like a lot of films are not, at least on the local level, are still is the reason why they exist in all of these sort of in bubbles almost in neighborhoods where where there are a couple of cinemas and you can sort of have a more traditional cinema experience. A lot of those films they don't travel, and I think that one of the biggest reason for that is that it's literally illegal to do business with some of these spaces, and B, the way that they work is takes a level of openness and generosity that really disrupts what sort of a closed ownership-based environment requires cinema to be. And so we were learning by re-releasing Maangamizi in this way, by engaging video jockeys and video translators and people who sell and distributors, informal distributors as well, who have wide networks, who manage to get CDs or videos to the furthest corners of the city where where it's hard to get to, and who know what the taste of that corner, what the history of film watching in that corner is like. We knew that these are, if we are to get to a place where we're able to reclaim a lot of the moving image history, part and parcel of that is sort of, again, creating a connection between those who have been able to sort of resist that absence in a healthy way, not just sort of defer to like what the great film, what film industry should look like, but who have taken this absence of recognition, this absence of presence, and turned it into like self-sustaining communities based on a love of film.
Yeah, this is true, Jay. Valid points. Martin, did you have anything to add on that informality, like what we can learn from the informal, what we can learn from informal film cultures and integrate into traditional distribution?
What I can say is that what we learn is that there are problems with government policy, legislation, which I think stops people from being even more creative. In many ways, I mean, maybe the Vibandas are a creative way of going beyond the government policies, but they invariably are forced to stay at a certain level where they still are not going to be breaking laws, so to say. They have to survive, but we have to survive at a certain level. And I think what it only means it means that we actually have to think outside the box all the time when we deal with these spaces of communal communication through film, because one, there's need for that kind of communication to also develop as a formal cultural enterprise uh, for knowledge creation as well as for recreation. But not only that, I think we also need to start to think about how we can even encourage those those individuals or groups of individuals or organized individuals to start to think about creating new spaces for them to reach audiences, and to access movies that are different from what the current policies basically are working towards. And I think that is what I'm learning from them. And I think if many of us can start to look at getting those meanings behind the experiences that these bandas and these DJs or VJs are doing, that would help us to start to think about creating new concepts about distribution in Africa, distribution of films in Africa. Maybe stop there.
Thanks, Martin. June.
Well, I suppose our position is slightly different. As I said, we're an archive that's been in existence for a number of years now, but without any structural support in terms of funding. And everything that we do in partnership with other organizations or as projects. So there's sometimes a bit of project support for us to do things. And that has been very much our structure of working with partners, both partners within academia, but also within the community. When I took the archive out of storage, first it was in my house and then it was in storage for a number of years. It was quite costly. When I took it out of storage, I got space at the Stockwell, Brixton and Stockwell Community Centre. And they gave me a space where I had 5 years to sort through the archive. And at that space, we was able to actually engage people. We ran workshops. We did screenings around their open days. And that was sort of a very basic. And we did screenings and we did little production, video production workshops. And they would produce things and then we would have little premieres with where they get to show their work and that sort of thing. But that was very much in the community context. And while we were there, we also had a lot of people who were hearing about the archive and would come from academia to say, well, what's happening? What is this? And other artists, people who I'd known through their work and they'd known me through the curatorial work that I had done for years. And those people came in to find out and they were quite supportive. Sonia Boyce was one of them. She used to come. Emma, who's here and who's one of the directors, used to come. So we had a sort of a very mixed, constituency of people who would be using the archive and who the screenings were reaching. After a certain amount of time, we couldn't stay there any longer because the structure of the building was moving, and we got some space at Mayday Rooms, which is itself a big non-governmental archive based in the centre of London, and they support small independent archives, alternative archives, I suppose you could say. And we've been there for the past 6 years almost. And there we're able to do screenings where we make no charge. We're able to do screenings and publicise them, and people come for free. But also in that time, we were also able to have more frequent connections with students, and some quite structured with academia. And we co-curated a big part of the archive, a big exhibition that included a number of screenings, both at Mayday Rooms where we're based, but also within the university students that were, the university locations that were partnering with us in the programming. At that time, Professor Sonia at Chelsea, so we did one at Chelsea, and we also did a small exhibition and discussion around the films at Birkbeck, which is where Emma is based. But we also were able to work with various other institutions that have young people who are interested in this work. And going back, to UAL, we had students who would come in and do residencies and make work in relation to the residencies, and those would also be shown as part of a bigger network of screenings in different spaces that we would have relationships with. Smaller, I mean, there are a number of small community organisations. There's one in West London that do regular screenings, very good programming, and our other director, Imru Bakari, has been very involved in that one, and we take screenings, we take materials to that. But I mentioned the students who make work because that was another way of expanding the work of the archive and getting people to know about it. And they made work in relation to what we have in the archive, and was taking that out. But we do also do major screenings around some of the work that we have. I don't think I mentioned You Hired Me. Did I mention?
No, not yet, which is what
You
I was
Hired
gonna
Me
ask
is
you
one
about.
of the films that we've had in the archive. It was made in 1970 by a Ghanaian filmmaker, and it was about restitution of African art. It's a documentary, a short documentary. So in 2020, it was the 50th anniversary of that event, of that film that we had in the archive, and it was still his. It was his. It was still his film. It was on 16mm, but what I had was VHS, and he had a better tape version of it. And because he's somebody I know, he's a friend, we've been in touch, kept in touch for years. We decided we would do something to mark the 50th anniversary of that film. And the idea was that there would be a series of screenings, talks, etc. Of course, COVID hit in 2020, and it became a webinar series. And that in itself worked quite well because we had participants from, not only from the UK, but also from Ghana, Nigeria, the US, and scholars as well as people, and people who consume, who are interested in the topic as well. And that worked quite well. But what has come out of that, and what I think would be most useful for this discussion and for the people here, is to know that out of that webinar series, which we had 4 webinars on this issue with many different people who work in the sector and from different relationships to the work, was that we started a podcast series, the first of which is already out, and it features, that first one features an interview with Jean-Marie Tenno, a Cameroonian filmmaker, well-known Cameroon documentary filmmaker. And he talks in it very much about this this subject of of restitution of the moving image, and one of our panels within the webinar series focused specifically on restitution of the moving image, and that was chaired by Jihano Tahari. But he talks about that in this first webinar series, about the complexities of being an African filmmaker who's made these films and wants to get it out, and it's not actually, it's becoming so complex. And he's also made a film, because it reminded me with what Jesse was saying, because he's made a film also called Lieux Saints, meaning sacred places. And it was made in Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou. And for anybody who knows, Burkina Faso is the country, Ouagadougou is the city where the Pan-African Film Festival is held every 2 years, and it has been since '69. And it's a big, major festival where people come to from all over the world. And he made a film about what was happening in some of the small community areas. I mean, it is a very popular festival because, I mean, the people of Ouagadougou and of further around actually go to see these films from all over the continent, but to some extent all over the world as well. The Pan-African world. So they come there to see that. But he made this little film about what was happening in the small community areas, where people, it's a dirt floor, a shack, and however they get the films on tape or wherever, they were showing those, and people would come and pay next to nothing, and there's a little bench, and they would watch those. So it's just another level at which people are finding ways to extend or to make available films that might not otherwise be seen. I mean, there's obviously lots of issues around any legality for any of that, but there is, it's like
cultural value.
Showing films or screening films by any means necessary. There's lots more we could talk about, but the time is short.
For several more hours. Did you want to?
I think I'd just say, I really enjoyed hearing what everyone was saying about the informality of community spaces and the value behind community spaces, and remembering that that's where people are. And I think not forgetting that, by going bigger and more broader, potentially we're losing some of the context and the value with that. And one of the things that I'm doing in Leeds is working with Scalarama. I don't know if you have heard of it, but essentially it's a space in which we empower individuals and community groups and anyone to put on their own screenings. So it's kind of letting people know that you don't have to be going to the cinema. We love cinemas, I work in a cinema, but just empowering people to put on the films that they can't see on the big screen and make their own big screens. So I think, just as a final word, I think with regards to, it's one of the things I really wanted from the discussion was kind of as well to inform what people are doing, but also let the sector know what would be supportive of it. But I think it's very much going to meet people where they're at, and I think maybe not being so tied into bringing everything back into the space, the institutions that we work in, but the freedom to allow the films to go elsewhere and maybe not be in the most formal of spaces, because there's value elsewhere too.
Thank you.
Is that okay time-wise?
Sorry.
Thank you so much to everybody who's here today. I'm really grateful for you, the audience, for being here, and our guests have been fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody.